explain this, but from the point of view of like the scriptures, there's some explanation which seems to kind of illustrate this. The idea that when you have very stable concentration, so you have very stable concentration, and Geshe-la has a watch in front of him, a clock in front of him. So he's saying that through this concentration, the person is able to topple this watch over, so make it fall over. So if that is possible, well, if the consciousness doesn't move there, how is it possible for that clock to fall over due to the force of concentration? So if it's the consciousness is over here, but the clock is over there, how does the clock fall over? So there's a way in which one can actually consider that the consciousness needs to go towards the object and be responsible for it falling over.
Dida tishi shandayi toni jabe yongda yunguri de diye samda tanya chik chagiduwa.
So then there's also another way of explaining that, but anyway, there is a way in which one can consider this. There's a way in which one can take this into consideration.
Da chikla kariyo resana mazu da bardo yunne gauso. Tanda da ko semdi lene subudira wa yundi pa ile dugo marwa. Bardo yunne gauso kawa tenpa yunne de kiji chik le dhugre kiji shigduwa. Simdi temba da simdi pagi lebi wangdi leb ane simdi da ludi tamu inza an digi ludi le zhuechi den digi xie gong men digi chagido.
So this other explanation that we should give some consideration to here is the idea of a parallel being, or as it's called in English, it's an intermediate state being, that the idea with regard, or the explanation that is given with regard to the intermediate state being is that the person can immediately arrive in the place that he or she is thinking about. So this intermediate state being has a very subtle body, and therefore wherever the mind of that person goes to, the person arrives naturally, arrives spontaneously. So this is due to this forced subtle body, whereas in our case, having such a forced body, we're not able to arrive at that place. But the person with such a subtle body, this being with such a subtle body, is automatically able to arrive in the place that he's thinking about.
Da kandar simdi pagi chardangchi genbe any kari charsati the simdi legire siye dingi tanda yaguchi tuto masu. Kisi diji tutoru tubeji yueba ina, tubchiji yaguchi kuetu na. Ani shine da simdi kunchab chaduro da. Chetamji kenru di kensati the simdi lidi simdi chabduro da samad. Chabna, sheba di chabna, da digana ngagi shungi shesha jodigi kowa di tsunebe jangondu, sheba da nyamdo yuebe da lung, tamu, su di ni chabdurda. Sanji di chikche di chabdurda.
So therefore, there's a way in which one can consider this possibility that the consciousness actually can arrive at the place or at the object that I'm thinking about, so and arrive at the place where the object is that I'm thinking about. So anyhow, with regard to now the object of one's desire or one's aversion, so can the mind arrive at those objects? So this is, because they're not really clear to me, and it would become a kind of a proof for if one was able to establish that the mind does arrive at the place where the object is, we can come to the conclusion that the mind, in particular the awareness of the Buddha, is all pervasive, so that the consciousness actually pervades the physical plane, if you like, it's all pervasive. And here in particular, when we combine this idea of the Buddha's mind being all pervasive, if we combine that with the tantric explanation, and add the tantric explanation when we talk about the very subtle wind, the subtle mind, and so then it's not just the mental faculty, but also the physical, in other words, the subtle energy wind, that this becomes simultaneously is all pervasive, can be in different places at the same time. So this is what one can establish then.
Ni toye chila tindiji jesu ni mabecheshina ngagi shungji nanglola. Do lula ani migi ngunshe, nayu ngunshe, ta sudatiru reja ngala tidi, di mato, an nayu ngunshe, je ngunshe, luji ngunshe yomarwa. Da di jidu di dan tingsangi chucha chabudo, su dang, su nyen dang, chadi pa dang togudo, ji dang, ro dang reja duzu daya kemido, da di chabudo, do lugi di.
So Geshe-la said, I saw this kind of reference in one of those scriptures, in one of the tantric scriptures, where it talks about in the sutric system, you have a clairvoyance of the eye and you have clairvoyance of the ear. So you have that kind of visual clairvoyance and you have audio clairvoyance. But there's no clairvoyance that is associated with the other senses. So the body consciousness and nose consciousness and the tongue consciousness, which is also similar to the idea that sound can be perceived from a distance. Sound and visual phenomena can be perceived from the distance. There's a way in which something can be further away. Sound can also be sent forth, sent forth visual objects. One is unable to do that with the other sense objects, such as smell, such as taste, and such as tangibility. So one is unable to send it somewhere else, so to perceive it. So that's probably connected also with the idea that there's clairvoyance with regard to like audio, clairvoyance with regard to sound, and clairvoyance with regard to visual objects.
都没有办法透过任何的这种仪器能够送到很远的地方让另外一个人知道。
ngā ki lū la jē ngū shē yō rēs, lū jī ngū shē. Tī la tēn tā rī ngū lē nā rō nyōng tū gu rī tā, ngū shē tī yō tā.
What finds the explanation of a clairvoyance that is associated with the tongue consciousness or with the tongue taste and the tangible object. So according to the tantric system, you can experience taste from far away.
Tā tī kī pari yō rē tī kā rē sē na, ngā ki lū lī lūng tī lī lē kā kui tū gu wā rwa, tō chō lī lūng tī nān chō rī yō ngā rwa. Sē tā lūng tī lē kā kui tī lūng tī pā tāng xā tī, anī pā kī tā tī kā lā wā tā lū chā mō tī pā kī lē wā chā wā rwa tā. Tī kī chē xē wā yī na chē sāng sēm pā kī lē tū, anī pā kī sēm tī pā kī chā rī wā, chā tāng chī kī tō nē pā kī lē pī sē kī chē tī xē gu yā chī.
So the difference here is therefore that in the tantric system, you have the subtle
sēm tī chā tāng, chā tāng.
you have this, you have the, in the tantric system, you have the explanation of the subtle winds, the subtle energy winds. So you can kind of send them forth. You send forth these subtle energy winds, so this kind of subtle body, and then in that way the awarenesses are also sent to a certain place. So this would explain then that you have an appearance, the mode of appearance to the mind of something further away, that you can actually reach that object by way of depending on, by way of relying on the subtle energy winds that take you to where the object is. So these subtle energy winds, if they go to that place, the mind also goes to those places. And that is a way in which one can explain how phenomena appear then to the mind.
제상 답변은 단 밀랑기 냠내 칭힌 두수기 아니 가르 롱디 timba카도 리디로 밀랑 차례디 요에 tingde timbarwa 제상 timbar리 리디자네 밀랑디 디치고로 디주디 롱디 데까고 밀랑 데고 요해라 밀랑 나는 냠내 지에치도 단 롱데 까고디 아니 미버디 다 데심 데샤르다 디남로르 미니 다 인주저 디치기는 데르 미니 검샤디 sim di di legi ora, ta komsa di la. Legi yo insan sim lesa di la lung di ne di ora. Chisa sim komsa di la sim legi me na, ani de kom ne lung di yo le pen toa da mi do.
So, for example, those who engage in dream yoga, like practitioners who practice with the dreams, like dream yoga, so what they do is they kind of stop the winds, they kind of bring the winds to the throat chakra. So, so in this case here, one visualizes the seats of the syllable at the throat, and by focusing on that, here the winds come together at the throat, and when they come together there, well, it's because the mind focuses on there. So by way of focusing on it, the awareness goes to that place, and it means that also the winds collect there. They come together, they assemble in that place. So if that wasn't true, that is where the winds go, the mind goes, and where the mind goes, the winds go, the energy winds go, then this meditation wouldn't be possible.
这时候风才会稳定的停留在喉咙这个位置上，他的梦才能够长久的，他才能够长久的处在这个梦境当中，然后在梦的这种状态当中去做休息。因此我们说呢，心所 修之处，如果心没有到的话呢，那怎么可以说心在修那个地方呢？所以既然心有到的地方，心有到的话，风也就到了。所以从这个状况，我们可以解释说呢，心到，心有缘到，那心就到了。
其实他故地他强的有，你知道他长么个强的有的，但本来身体故地有个，他干嘛听到了土有个，故有个给这些了。但有的嘛，印度的可是对最低了，年纪他年纪大呢，那身体没属同类的节气，他基本的都是大着呢。基基大上了，他身体下流下去，也对了。他这个大听见中那了了，他变成其中前面样这个节气的这个的谁，的节气听见的中那，我让你们的中那，基基大上了前面样下流了嘛都，前面样他的我的出配过来给我们。
So, for example, when we talk about the Buddha's body, so the Buddha's body is said to be all-pervasive. However, it's not just the Buddha's body, the physical body, but also the mind of the Buddha is said to be all-pervasive. And Geshe-la says, well, if Geshe-la himself were to be able to eliminate all the obscurations that right now prevent him from seeing the Buddha's body, so if they are eliminated, he would be able to therefore perceive it. So, for example, with regard to perceiving, directly perceiving Manjushri. So, if the Buddha, say Manjushri being all-pervasive in this room, and if then all the facilities, whatever is necessary, so all the obscurations being eliminated, whatever facility, whatever is needed in order now to see Manjushri, comes from his own side, all that is there from his own side, he fulfills all the conditions in order to be able to perceive Manjushri, then Manjushri doesn't have to come from somewhere else first. No, you would be able to automatically to perceive him right here because he's all-pervasive.
다 파게 군첩차대 되게 파게 기시다 뒤직라 미동자 치자 분자직 아니 전변 지역이다 기진제 등에서는 아니 동자 치자직 직접도 샤르도를 이 갈래게 내다.
So then, if the Buddha is all-pervasive, then, or if the Buddha's figure, the Buddha emanations are all-pervasive, then one is able at the same time, 10,000s, 100,000 people, if from their side, whatever prevents them from perceiving the Buddha, whatever, if all the circumstance, if that is gone, what prevents them, if all the facilities are there, then simultaneously these 10,000s, thousands of people are able to perceive the Buddha's body.
다 딘디 샤레기 뉴버디 유베 강라 딘디기 다 강라 강팽 다 가시의 전비양기 넘버지는 펜도요는 전비양 넘버 샤레 지니시 넘버지는 지 펜도요는 지니시 넘버 샤레 미규메 넘버된 펜도요는 미규메 넘버를 샤레요에 그래서 강라 강팽만 네 가지 샤레입니다. 그래서 강라 강팽 샤레요에 다 퉁문이라지 샤야디 다 전민지 그게 심지 탐지의 펜비규를 워샤고 디왕기다 퉁문이라지 다 디인서를 배 강라 강팽 샤레디.
So then, therefore, there is this ability to appear in any kind of place and in appearing in a way that is most beneficial. So to a person, for some people it may be most beneficial that the Buddha appears in the form of Manjushri, or the Buddha of wisdom. And for some it is most conducive, most beneficial if the Buddha appears as the Buddha of compassion or Avalokiteshvara. And for a third person it may be most beneficial that the Buddha appears as an ordinary person. So the Buddha would appear in the most effective way. So the Buddha would never appear in a way which harms the person, but the opposite in a way which is most beneficial. So this ability to appear commonly to beings, that is due to the love and compassion that the Buddha has generated at the time of when he was still in training as a Bodhisattva, and due to the dedication of having dedicated the merit that he's accumulated by generating love and compassion. So through this dedication, now the Buddha is able to appear to sentient beings in such a common way.
靠着这样子的一种回向，靠着我们刚才讲这个菩提心，那使得他所做的一切的显现，都只会为众生带来利益。
就是他第国的拉比套的，那第国的落了车一起的，我说初心公平的主义呢，那咱们这商业这个证据什么这个，他错这个他，这个咱们这开始拍照的，开始处用那个有些人呢，我对公平的，公平的地的，因为落了车过来的地的，那个古坤切、宋坤切的，강라 강도도 촬영해야지. 이 고와디 셈의 샤니 아니 디차레 되나라 디디 공부도
So therefore, in order to get that kind of understanding, for that to become clear to the mind, that the Buddha's body is all pervasive, the mind is all pervasive, all that becomes clear when we do the meditation on the merit field. So the merit field, you have Buddhas appearing, Bodhisattvas appearing, you have Uttas, Vitaktas, and so forth appearing. So they're all in the nature of light, and they come and they go, and they're different kinds of appearances. So that trains the mind, that makes it clear, or it appears to the mind in that way, what becomes obvious to the mind, or from the point of view of the appearance here, when it becomes clear that the Buddha's body, the physical body, is all pervasive. So this is what
有的观想方法上面是佛的各种样的这个化身，然后从他的心间放出以及收尾等等这样。但其实他主要的理解的就是刚才我们所说的这种，他的心、他的身、他的周遍一切有情的这种概念。
大感觉头脑路了，你写着经验几月把这个经验吃把的了，土给吃不的是，土给经验吃把的了，贵吃不的是，贵经验吃把的了。 아니 송기 차그레스 어디 요래 다 잡단 잡루 지시디 다 내라는 신이나 양신다 잡고도 다 주로다.
So therefore, with regard to whichever object is realized, so with regard to whichever awareness that realizes its object, well, that is all pervasive. If that is all pervasive, then likewise, whichever body, whichever physical body of a Buddha there is all pervasive. So the mind is all pervasive, any kind of mind is all pervasive, any kind of awareness of a Buddha is all pervasive, and then of course the speech of the Buddha is also pervasive. And the way in which the Buddha's mind and so forth, the body and so forth, is all pervasive, well, if that's the way I've explained it, the reason I've given for why they're all pervasive or different, or it's because of a different reason, that is to be seen.
제자다 간들이야 산지에서 진리 배밀 춘주도 주에 제시디리 장이 리수주가 탐지기 다 가리고 월서는 산지도 똑같이 배워 잡고 와다. 군론 똑같이 군론 대반에 버시 잡고 와.
So, but anyway, when we talk about the Buddha's effortless enlightened activities, the Buddha is able to effortlessly, spontaneously to engage in enlightened activities. And that is because the Buddha's consciousness is free from the dependence on conceptual awareness. So it is not limited, it is not dependent on any kind of conceptual awareness any longer, but therefore the Buddha is able to spontaneously engage in effortless enlightened activities. So that is due to the absence of the conceptual consciousness.
딜라 뒤전에 아니 가수그래 다다 가시기 샤다 가시기 아니 가장 건강한 가장 이만한 신시바 마세 양 리치기 유몬 도해라 러시메도 냐도 공고레스 러시메바디 양 또바메바 차야 된다라 아니 제제디 제비 터치야 있는 메시바디 인고레스 이거 공고레스 된듯이 이제 용도.
So, saying that, there are some people, so as we discussed previously, some people say in order to eliminate the afflictions, overcome or eliminate the afflictions, one needs to meditate on the lack of intrinsic existence. But in order to eliminate any kind of elaboration by conceptual consciousness, so to free oneself from the elaboration by conceptual consciousness, one needs to meditate on the lack of mental ability, mental activity. So in other words, one needs to engage in the absence of mental activity. Some say in order to reduce or to eliminate conceptual consciousness, one needs to do that second type of meditation.
다 가시고래 디디기 제제스미 다그다 제제밍 다사고 다 키미다 시다기 시에는 신 마레스 가리인의 메나 가지 이모토의 시리도의 탐지를 하시는 공부를 디기 가시고래서는 나심에고 공부되기 지성기다 고슈치를 치미쇠기 라신 주변 심바들 뇌고레스 진단기와 인자 라신 주변 심바를 뇌받은 냠도 라신 주변 심바 샤비 바차들 뇌고레스 디지도 전에 라볼도 전주생기 심비토네 고명나 아니 라신 주변 심바 삼아세 라신 주변 심바디 바차들 지고 세도 그래 디 세바이나 또바께서 요말 그래서는 또바세에 대물 주변 나고라 데모도 만나는 또 뭐게 요 말어 데모도 나 중에디 다 땡징기 바샤디기 나 주고 땡징기 바샤디 매가 차서는 데모도 나에 매가 차용디 또 세루레스 지금 또 세야 된다는 로가지 공고 말에 또 세게 다시 다가르레스
But in response to that, so others would say that engaging in the stopping of any kind of activity, that is not the way to overcome these deliberations. So whether you call it deliberations or not, but this, here others would claim that it is not only from the point of view of eliminating the afflictions, eliminating the grasping onto inherent existence, not just from that perspective when you meditate on the lack of inherent existence, but also to eliminate the conceptual consciousness, the conceptual awareness, the elaborations in order to overcome those. It is sufficient to meditate on the lack of inherent existence. Why? One doesn't need to meditate on, one doesn't need to engage in that stopping of mental activity, but it's possible by merely meditating on emptiness or the lack of inherent existence, because if one meditates on the lack of inherent existence, one therefore eliminates one harms the mind that grasps onto inherent existence, because those two awarenesses are totally opposite with regard to the reference objects that they take to mind. So by realizing the lack of inherent existence, one is able to eliminate the mind that grasps onto inherent existence. So it harms the mind by way of being the direct opposite of that wrong perception with regard to the main object. And if one eliminates the mind that grasps onto inherent existence, eliminating that, and then on top of that, one also generates bodhicitta, well then, not only is one able to eliminate the mind that grasps onto inherent existence, but one is also able, by way through the force of bodhicitta, to eliminate the imprints of the mind that grasps onto inherent existence. And those imprints are responsible for the appearance of inherent existence, so the appearance of true existence. Now, a conceptual consciousness is a mind that has the appearance of true existence, has the appearance of inherent existence. So we cannot have a conceptual consciousness to which inherent existence or true existence does not appear. But if you have eliminated the imprints that lead to the appearance of true or inherent existence, then you can no longer have a conceptual consciousness. So therefore, with the elimination of the imprints, you also automatically eliminate or overcome conceptual consciousness.
That dinner shinji simran shingi tongbas la na mega charuwa. Shingi tongbi sim sini samna tangba ina ra shingi chuba meba samna tangbi to ne migba di sim dil migba ina mahinka charuwa. Diji duzane ta tanda ningme chogi ningman da chajen da kongzugi shungkashi nang lo la pake rashingi tongbi da jiri semi ina da sem chamu ina da kachi rashingi meba tena pet rashingi yoba ma inba tena pet an digi tone an tenjigi tongbi an sem dila mingni komeji sungu yusarwa chesan da mahinga zhabu chadarwa disi du an kashigi an ningma da gilu chagima re chig mahinga gongo re chig an mega gongo re tenji shingi yo res an kyungmura mu chigi soya da an pake mahinga gomsiye di chitang khorane tendu gome kije mares negab chigringla ani mahinga de gomgoyeji di gangzen kharese na ani sem chamodi pyida boji ngondu gyurechi da besegi sem dila toni gajo gomne sem chamo ngondu gyuela pengmarwa ninde jajuma de zui galbada kebebodo toni nya barshane sem chamodi ngondu gyurwa mara ngane shibi sem chamodi 제가 ngane shibi sem chamodi ngondu gyurechi do 다 pake tawa 가주이나 로치니나 가주이나 내급지 링라 아니 마인가 다가란 고메지 순거 레슨 군딩이 순거다.
So likewise, when we talk about the lack of, for example, when we talk about the lack of inherent existence of consciousness, well, that is a non-affirmative negation. The lack of inherent existence of the mind is a non-affirmative negation. But lack of so the mind lacking inherent existence, or I should say, the mind lacking inherent existence, that is a non-affirmative negation. Whereas the non-inherently existing mind is an affirmative negation. So mind lacking inherent existence is a non-affirmative negation, whereas non-inherently existing awareness or non-inherently existing mind is an affirmative negation. Now, according to some of the scriptures in the Nyingma tradition, or in the Mahamudra tradition, so in those traditions there is the explanation that one should actually, doesn't matter whether you talk about the coarser type of mind or the subtle type of mind, one should focus on that affirmative negative, the affirmative negative which is the non-inherently existent mind. So you will find the explanation of focusing on that non-affirmative negative, on that affirmative negative, the non-inherently existent mind, as opposed to mind not existing inherently, which is sort of a negation that doesn't affirm anything positive. So in the Nyingma scriptures, there is this emphasis on focusing on the non-inherently existing mind, affirmative negative, and some people therefore saying that if that is in the Nyingma tradition, if that is being emphasized, then there's a difference between the Nyingma and the Gelugpa tradition, because in the Gelugpa tradition, you focus on the mere non-affirmative negative, whereas in the Gelugpa tradition, you focus on the non-affirmative negative, whereas in the Nyingma tradition, you focus on the affirmative negative. So some people differentiate or distinguish the two traditions from that point of view. But as Homer, the Dalai Lama is saying, no, that is not true, that this is a misunderstanding basically in the Nyingma tradition, that one only focuses, that one exclusively focuses on such affirmative negation, because one only does so for some time, one only temporarily focuses on such affirmative negation in order to generate the subtle mind, the subtle clear light mind. Because just realizing emptiness itself, one is not able to manifest the subtle clear light mind. Why? Because the hearers and solitary realizers for many eons, they focus on emptiness itself, but they're unable to generate the subtle mind that is explained in the tantric system, the very subtle clear light mind. So that is made manifest not just by meditating on emptiness or non-affirmative negative, but on an affirmative negative as described before.
아니 제르무지 손나로레 리시 엔 대화침을 쪼을 검수마들이 요레스 이다지 버레스무다.
So also one finds in Lama Tsongkhapa's writings, where Lama Tsongkhapa says for the time being one should mainly focus on great bliss. So for the time being or temporarily one should focus on great bliss. So this is similar.
전 참선을 된지 죽음에로 섬진 신의금이 된지 나로 요래 간된지 아니 파게 남긴 개와지에 여러 뒤주 참아 알레 잠샤네 아니 파게 찌찌도 디콤스 센티 소에디 신의다 다와 주이나 다와 로지이나 오늘랑 비슷한 제등이 두지 어디링들 끼지 시고 알아 지단에 잠샤이 끼지 시고 알아 디 투제 아니 다 신의권 하고려고 매이나 다 켜불리는 신의권 같은 shum이나 다 미고 다가마도 신의 상을 잠시할 수인데 지단에 잠시에 상을 거지 아니 미지지도 걸어서 이거 건데는 초로다 진행신 추구면서 같이 요즘 차상 맞칭이 되지.
And so therefore one sometimes may come to this misperception, that kind of a misperception or misunderstanding may arise, that when one, for example, meditates on certain states of concentration, when one is very interested in generating certain concentrated states, such as calm abiding, so one really makes an effort over 6 months or 1 year, and one is advised for that time, for the time being, while one generates those types of concentration, to leave away, to not engage in prayers, to not engage in the accumulation of merit. Some people think this is true forever. So actually here the instructions are just for the time being. One should not be distracted by accumulation of merit or by doing one's prayers and so forth. But this is only for the time being until one has generated those concentrations. Or for example, when one generates or tries to generate non-abiding by focusing on the body of the meditation of deity, only during the time when we meditate on that meditation of deity in order to generate calm-abiding, one should leave aside any other practice. But that doesn't mean it should be left aside for good. So some people misunderstand that their entire life they don't do anything just focusing on the practice of this meditation of deity, but misunderstanding that these instructions were only given for temporary, for some time, and then one should resume one's ordinary practice.
The dinner scene some of you are a topic of some corner, Matia Kazir, Norbares, Nora Trubare, Semicona, Kadul the Pengri, Peggy Suzu Kondo Yesadi, Nomaneva Denapep, Denapep Sana Nishineta, Mara Ture, Tingro, Mara Ture, then Peggy the Valentation, Koti Kadu Pengro. Chesa Tobeta was some race in Tembaina, Digi Tobetas a Mahimbi, Sympathy Kedura, Zendangiorva. Tobetas a Mahimbi Zimbachuni Mena, Tobetas a Mahimbi, you was sympathy later Yomaro. Revola Zimbokora Mena, Revola Yubatzimba later for Yomaro. Tobetas a Mahimbi Zimbokora Mevachana, Tobetas a Mahimbi Yubatzimba later Yomaro. Chesan Tobeta Tabasam Sin Komshana, Tavaraneta. Tamada Tenjima Totu to us, Megadi Congo and do us and that you will see.
So then another kind of question that may arise that some people say one doesn't have to meditate on the lack of inherent existence, one doesn't have to meditate on that kind of non-affirmative negative, but one can also focus, one may just focus on phenomena being merely imputed by conceptual consciousness, that this would be sufficient. So of course in general it is true that directly it may be beneficial, like for example when I'm angry with someone, when I'm angry towards aversion towards someone, then that one may feel, oh, I'm wrong, because actually the person is merely imputed, the situation is merely imputed by a conceptual consciousness. So it may help one's awareness in that moment, one's misperception in that moment to be weaker, to be reduced. And also, of course, if one perceives what one does is the perception that phenomena do not exist. The perception that phenomena do not exist independent on being merely imputed by conceptual consciousness, that is in direct opposition to the mind that perceives phenomena being merely imputed by conceptual consciousness. So that misperception that phenomena do not exist independent on being merely imputed by conceptual consciousness is directly opposed by a mind that understands phenomena are merely imputed by conceptual consciousness. And if you didn't have one, you couldn't have the other. So likewise, Geshe-la is saying, if you didn't have a mind that perceives the non-existence of the horns of a rabbit, you couldn't have the perception of, you couldn't have a mind that perceives the horns of a rabbit. They're kind of dependent on one another. But anyhow, the point is here, Geshe-la is saying that without meditating on emptiness, without meditating on the lack of inherent existence, in other words, without meditating on a non-affirmative negation, wouldn't it be possible by merely meditating on the fact that phenomena are imputed independence on conceptual consciousness, meditating on that alone, that one attains liberation and Buddhahood.
Tobeta zama himbi tsimba tili negro. Tobeta zama himbi tsimba slavro. Tinena tobeta zama himbi tsimba di kyuni mena. Then you won't get me to us. She's a new mother, she did something to us.
So, if we meditate on the fact that phenomena are merely imputed by conceptual consciousness, then the awareness that perceives, that grasps that phenomena are not merely imputed by conceptual consciousness, that is eliminated, that is contradicted. So therefore, our afflictions, they arise from that misperception. That phenomena are not, from the misperception that grasps at phenomena not being merely imputed by conceptual consciousness. So our afflictions and corporative aspirations may arise from that misperception, and therefore one could argue that by merely realizing or independence on the realization that phenomena are merely imputed by conceptual consciousness, theoretically, wouldn't one be able to eliminate that misperception and therefore all the other afflictions, all the other obscurations that arise from that?
다 본것도에 따서 공부이나 본것도에 따서 많이 비교도 키루래. 길미비다 용어도서 가와 차샤. 이네 다 가와 하대요. 가와도에 따서 공부는 디키루도 야신다 하대요. 디제와 이는 다 아니 다 쳐를 타요 말에 아니 창문 공부 주는 권차에 누워서. 제 딜레 아니 랑문에 매고 건나 아니 지바로 왔어. 본보랑문에 매고 건나 본벌에 모두 더야 가와 하대요로 말하나 다 민자와 가르에서는 아니 공부하는 게 왜냐 매바디 아니 무슨도 또나 가와라는 게 왜냐 매바디 무슨도 또 비차그레스 안 공부도 베다좀 또나 무슨도 또나 가와도 베다좀 무슨도 또나 거는 요 말이스 스타티체벌 도스인다 렌지
Some people respond response to this previous debate. They will say, well, when you, for example, realize that the vase, an example such as the vase, that this is merely imputed by conceptual consciousness, one is able to eliminate, one is able to overcome or to contradict the mind that perceives the vase as not being merely imputed by conceptual consciousness. And one is therefore also able to eliminate the afflictions that will arise out of the misperception that perceives the vase to be not being merely imputed by conceptual consciousness. However, one is unable to eliminate the misperception with regard to a pillar, for example. So having eliminated the perception with regard to the vase, one is still left with the misperception with regard to a pillar. So therefore, one would have to also generate an awareness that perceives the pillar as being merely imputed by conceptual consciousness. Now the problem is there's so many phenomena, there's no limit to the different types of phenomena, and one is unable to generate a wisdom that realizes with regard to each and every phenomenon that it is merely imputed by conceptual consciousness, so therefore it is impossible. And the argument is that by realizing the lack of existence from its own side, the lack of inherent existence of one phenomenon such as the vase, when one realizes one directly, one is able to realize also the lack of inherent existence of the pillar and so forth, or both phenomena. But then someone else may argue, no, that's not true. When you realize the lack of inherent existence of the vase, it doesn't mean that you also realize the lack of inherent existence of the pillar. So you have the same kind of problem here, in the same way with regard to the realization of the lack of inherent the realization of phenomena being merely imputed by conceptual consciousness, in the same way as you have to apply it to each and every phenomenon. This person would argue, in order to realize the same is true here for the realization of the lack of inherent existence, you need to apply it to each and every phenomenon. That's what someone would argue.
다 돈이 이게 지금 무슨 돈나 아니 최근제도 돈이 무슨 또 거래스 세다. 돈이 사면 뭐지 레스에다 주나 예대로 차대로. 다 디균쟁 하래. 지금 무슨 돈이 지금 또 거래. 아니 뭐지 뭐 이미 균쟁 하래. 다 디삼당 거래시로. 또 그도 뭐지 레스. 뭐지 갈지는 지금 돈이 지금 또 보다라는 백미다.
So, the answer that is usually given here to that lesser kind of opponent who would argue in such a way, the answer that is given is that when you realize the emptiness of one phenomenon directly, you realize the emptiness of all phenomena automatically. And there's also the explanation given in the scriptures that any type of emptiness, and all emptinesses are of one nature. So because they're of one nature, therefore when you realize the emptiness of one, you realize the emptiness of
逻辑
why
是
is
这样
that so?
子
This
呢？
needs to be examined.
既然
What
我
does that
见证
actually
地方
mean?
的空性，我
That
就
the
周遍
emptiness of
我
all
就周遍
phenomena
能够了
is
解
of
其他方
one
面的空
nature.
性。那为什么
So you
呢？
cannot
因
say,
为这
oh, it
那
is
为
of
什么
one
只
nature
是一
because
个这
all
样的一个
phenomena,
东西，
all
好像这
emptiness
种
of
概念
one
是这样的
emptiness
一
is
个答案
realized
一样，
directly,
所以
the
我必
other
须要这个
emptiness
解
is
释体
realized
系一的
directly.
这个答案
We're
是
saying
答案。
using one for the reason of the other. So it's not correct to say, also it's not correct to say that, oh, you realize the emptiness of one, then you realize the emptiness of the other. When you realize the emptiness of one phenomenon, you realize the emptiness of the other, because all the emptinesses are of one nature. That doesn't give us any extra explanation.
那对了，你不把人问的没吧？搞把人问的没吧？是在起用的，其实出现你的怕有呢，搞把的不把的怕有呢，人问的没吧？是你的了，你找去你们多少？这讲的话是他的。
So when we say the vase does not exist on its own side, pillar does not exist on its own side. So not existing from its own side, if you were to leave away the vase, if you were to leave away the basis of the vase or the pillar, you're left with just does not exist by way of its own nature or from its own side. So that is the same.
其实他我说当年我说的导用的出现给那我的农民。 出现给那农民团队，他去年的到队的，出现给要每位他呢去年可能了，他明朝些没有印象，缺他们这一的，当年到不来是的，这些的都是那位呢。
So then one may say then as an explanation here for why when you realize the emptiness of one, you realize the emptiness of all phenomena. So when you realize directly with regard to direct perception, when you realize the emptiness of one phenomenon, you realize the emptiness of all phenomena. Why? Because the mind that realizes emptiness directly, to that mind, the basis for the emptiness doesn't appear. So the basis for the emptiness, the basis of the vase and the pillar and so forth, they do not appear. So all that appears to that mind is the lack of inherent existence, is the lack of phenomena existing from its own side. And so therefore, there is no difference from the point of view of emptiness, which means when you realize the emptiness of one, you realize the emptiness of all phenomena.
出现给那我的奴才了，去年的嘛都差不了，快我都听我，去年的了没找要嘛是吧？没找钱的出现给可能钱不的，出现给那我的奴才了。
So really the difference between the emptiness of the vase and the emptiness of the pillar is not from the point of view of the emptiness, it's from the point of view of the vase and the pillar, which is the basis. But when you realize emptiness directly, the appearance of that basis, the appearance of the vase, the appearance of the pillar, that disappears. There is no appearance of the vase and the pillar. So this vanishes, which therefore means to that mind that realizes the emptiness of the vase and the pillar and so forth, only the emptiness itself appears. So there's no other appearance than the emptiness, so therefore they don't differ.
다 딜라나 아니 제가 세만 딜레다 추징이 나와 미나나 아니 제가 디게다 최든지 돈이 도구를 베스 제가 레인 거라 추징이 나와도 메나 추징이 나와 유나 안 디왕게 아니 비비징이도 가유징이도 수수 차로라 추징이 나와 메나 최든지 돈이 도구 집어 차로 거래 제가 세면 최든지 돈이 또 매바다 참 용도 차대요.
So it is usually known that when we talk about an inferential cognizer that realizes emptiness, that does not realize the emptiness of all phenomena. An inferential cognizer realizing emptiness realizes either the emptiness of the vase or the emptiness of the pillar or something else. It does not realize the emptiness of all phenomena. But what you could argue is, if to such an inferential cognizer, when it realizes the emptiness of the vase, for example, if the vase were to appear, well then that would explain why the inferential cognizer realizing the vase does not realize the emptiness of the pillar. But if the vase itself does not appear to the inferential cognizer realizing the emptiness of the vase, then there is no reason for saying why the emptiness of the pillar does not appear. So therefore we have to examine, does to an inferential cognizer that realizes emptiness, does to that awareness not only the emptiness but also the basis of the emptiness appear or not?
고고마기 나게 살아나는 동안 이게루라 추진하는 게 말이지. 달분들이 뭐도 주셔. 빈제는 무치기 돌루를 추진하는 게 내가 말이 말루를 남기래서 이와 체셔. 뉴르서 보시다.
With regard to this explanation of whether to an inferential cognizer that realizes emptiness, whether the basis appears or not, well, there's different explanations. For example, there's a Rinpoche Kangaru. So in his previous life, he composed a commentary, he composed a scripture or a text which is called The Stages, the Grounds and Stages of Tantra. And in that, there he gave the explanation that from the point of view of the tantric system and the sutric system, to an inferential cognizer, the basis of emptiness. That according to an inferential cognizer, whether it's the sutric system or the tantric system, the basis of emptiness does not appear. But then Dhamma Rinpoche in a previous life in his text, he said that according to the tantric system and the sutric system, that they do appear, whether you talk about the tantric system or the sutric system, to an inferential cognizer that realizes emptiness, the basis of the emptiness does appear. And then you have a third scholar, Benjamin Dappa. He said, according to the according to the sutric system, the basis of emptiness does not appear to an inferential cognizer or to a conceptual mind, whereas according to the tantric system, it does appear.
Dice, ane kazanta konema ta ngeshe di karishe yoresena, ane tonjin tona, tonjin la pai di cheba ina, chubo ina, ane pendo kari yume di chikshi, nima tabu nipa dira. Dine, ane tonjin se, tobe tazam se di, ane kandichi la siki yume, ane pake tatun zeche, ane rashin chubi chikda tade ma chubdang, o di zuyu tone ta rashin mebo komdang, ta ngesim chu di she, rwa, nipa dira. 디 제다 아니 가르시어스는다 러시메바 바게 니기슴 주디나로 러시메바도 메바 이와체 러시메바 곰단디에 아니 따라테네 러시민도 냠도 곰고레스 기제디시 다 디지디 디제라 아니 곰단디다 민자와 시에데에 두수기 아니 콩간데 시규메 디지다 마디 신주체체 다 러시메바 곰에다 디에 러시민도 냠도 곰고에딜라 아니 콩간데 유메 디 컴퓨터네 다 파게터 파게티가 세당당 안에 상계다 근데 이게 쇼업제시 다 딘디도 차대요. 단다부터 시단데.
So to kind of summarize what I've been explaining with regard, in particular, the meditation on emptiness, well, I kind of started off my explanation saying that one has to realize emptiness, one has to engage in the meditation on emptiness, and I've talked about the benefits of doing so. Likewise, I've also spoken about phenomena being merely imputed, what that actually means. And likewise, I've talked about phenomena being empty of existing as inherently one or inherently different. So we discussed that, and that therefore one understands that phenomena do not exist inherently. I've also spoken about, thirdly, I've spoken about the necessity of differentiating between not existing inherently and not existing in general, that one has to differentiate between the two. And then by way of a correct syllogism, depending on the correct syllogism, using a correct reason, then in dependence on such a correct reason, one can then come up to understand the lack of existence. And as a fourth point, I've introduced different kind of views with regard to how to meditate on the ultimate truth, how to meditate on emptiness. So I introduced different views. I've given the kind of source text for these different assertions, and I've also given you some explanation, kind of my own personal explanation, whether those meditations are in accordance with reality, they're okay or not, or realistic or not. And lastly, I've also spoken about, so the fifth point I've spoken about the necessity of having to realize the necessity of meditating on the lack of apparent existence, and how that understanding, that realization, so just focusing on meditating on lack of apparent existence in order to attain the state of the Buddha, how one can actually reach the state of the Buddha by way of meditating in that way. So this is what we've been discussing here, in particular with regard to how to meditate on emptiness.
다 양조 무튼이 초바이나 뒤더지 스피드 거다가 그래. 디나로라 산지기다 진입을 진수스 나부르다 디 가지 조조디 아니 대번이다 들어요디 교차디고 레디다 디 계제시 온디 전에 단다버도 시시죠 나로라 가시 데스코 하고 요래 가시 데스코레라고 요래 다 디펜지라 다 데스 갈라오다 진짜 토이 온도 진이 기지시 예지디 골레라고 기지시에 시라요 말다 마치 골 차부르고 차디고 제산다 디지디 되게 갈라오다 차부 중내 뒤에다 디지 어지에 되겠다 다 차부 중내 뒤에 이나 아니 못히니 저야지 디메나 다 다른다 지용비티 다른 슈팅의 뒤거다.
So again, now it will take me another week, I would say, or another week to now speak about the way the Buddha realizes varieties of phenomena, the way the omniscient consciousness of the Buddha realizes conventional truth. So this is connected to the explanation of the true truth, the ultimate and the conventional. So with regard to everything I've said earlier, well, some of the explanations I've given were more difficult, but others were easier. There were some explanations that were easier. From now on, it's going to get difficult. So from now on, what I'm going to speak about will be like a higher level, will be a more difficult level, so it will be more difficult. So now we need to reflect on, we need to think of whether you still have the time, you're dedicated to hearing something more difficult, whether we just leave it as such, the class as such, or we need to reflect on whether we should continue with this more difficult information.
가장 뒤어지는 거는 하대 기지치 가요스나 아니 나오나 돈이도비 제바세마디 아니 나오나 니나 아니 마토나야 니모나 니나 타우시에 다 긴기가 rum 제스 말이 심하다 랭가스리나 세고도 다디 가장 레디라 차와체 기루지 수에 집어체 타버도 단다 말이 심하디 나올라 아니 니모나 니나 말루글 니나 그래. 이는 너베 라우라다. 이나 뭐 리브 도베. 이나 네베. 아니 이나 요르시 미고신다 최고 말레스. 시디다 디기. 베게 나원은 이나 유나양. 나율도 이나 유나양. 아니 니 몰라. 이나 메바 인상. 이나 메바 소에기 미고신다지 되기 라이바. 아니 메도시에디 이모시에제. 이나 도에 탑시에디 양치야 이름이 좀 공부레스. 근데 술도 최고의 기회요 말에. 다른 게 인한 던지 누구 그래서 어디 숨도.
So there is another question, another issue that is left over here, something that still needs to be explained with regard to realizing emptiness inferentially, realizing emptiness with an inferential cognizer, with a conceptual mind. So here we talk about that conceptual mind from the point of view of appearance, the aspect of appearance to that mind, and the aspect of ascertainment of that mind, or the perspective of appearance with regard to that mind, and the perspective of ascertainment by that mind. So Genpito offers a kind of citation, a quotation from the stages of the path of Tantra, and likewise one also finds the explanation of the lamp that clarifies the five levels. So in those texts there is this explanation that from the point of view, or from the perspective of the perspective of the ascertainment, there is the mind is non-dual. From the perspective of appearance, the mind is not non-dual. So this means that, and this is the explanation you find in these texts, that with regard to this conceptual mind realizing emptiness, so that's the basis. From the point of view of